现在订阅同盟会英语，不论找工作、升学或英检，表现更棒。快上 StudioClassroom.com， 现在请收听教学节目。
Advanced Studio Classroom is on the air. Join us today as we return to the Faroe Islands. Hello, listeners. Welcome back to another Advanced Studio Classroom. Thank you for joining us today as we continue with the second day of our May travel article. And as I said in the introduction, we're going back to the Faroe Islands. Our article today is called The Faroe Islands, and it tells us that this is the land of 10,000 waterfalls. My name is Simon, and I'm joined in the studio today by the same two panelists who helped us explore the Faroe Islands yesterday. Josh, welcome back.
Thank you, Simon. It's always good to be back here. Always good to be talking about interesting places that I might want to visit one day.
Now, Josh, yesterday we learned a lot about the beautiful landscapes and the wonderful scenery and the remoteness, the isolation of the Faroe Islands. Did any of that appeal to you and make you want to visit?
It did. So there's something very magical about places that are without any sort of trees. So there's sort of like remoteness where you have big, wide open views of nature around you is very special. And I would love to go see that.
You know what appealed to me about it? I'm from a rural area, but even though I'm from the countryside, you sort of know that other people have been the place you are all the time. No matter where you are, other people have been there. And so you can see things like, even if you're out in the forest, the trees aren't that big because they've been cut down and replanted, 100 years ago, or you see an old, fence line or something like that. You're not really in a new, unexplored sort of place. But when you go to the northern part of Canada, you actually do get this feeling that you might be the first person there. It's so isolated and so lonely, and that's the thing that really appealed to this, to me about the Faroe Islands. Not so much the lack of trees, but the isolation. I thought that was great. We're also joined in the studio today by Rebecca. Welcome back, Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'm happy to be back as we continue talking about the Faroe Islands.
Now, Rebecca, in the second part of yesterday's lesson, we were talking about this little village that only had 3 families in it, right?
That's
we know
right.
The Faroe Islands only has a few people. It gets many more tourists than actual residents each year. But that's a newer thing, and we heard about this trend from a 25-year-old farmer. Can you tell us a little bit about this guy?
Oh, yes. The farmer, he was telling us that the way people found out about this small little village is through Instagram. And as most of you probably know, Instagram is very popular, and probably a lot of you are using Instagram and putting your own pictures on Instagram.
That's right. Now, this farmer, he was introduced to us as a farmer, kind of a young farmer from this isolated village yesterday. But as we continue with today's lesson, we're going to find out he's much more than just a farmer. He's also involved in the tourism industry. So I think we ought to jump right in. Listeners, if you have your Advanced magazine for the month of May, you can join us today on page 13 as we read today's lesson. Let's look at the first reading for today now.
Although Kausgero is now a part-time tourist guide, it hasn't all been a boon for him. Overflow crowds park cars on his fields. Some hikers litter, and others leave his red gate open, allowing his sheep to escape. If a hiker is injured, Kausgero calls a helicopter rescue, a free service for the hiker. A local newspaper said helicopters rescued 20 people on the Faroe Islands in 2018, half of whom were tourists. Growing popularity. The small Faroe Islands are trying to keep up with their growing popularity. The islands were voted the top destination by National Geographic Travelers readers in 2015. Since then, Airbnbs have popped up. 2 hotels, including the first chain hotel, a Hilton Garden Inn, were being built in the capital, Tórshavn, when I visited last spring.
Okay, and so at the very beginning of our reading today, we really get the feeling that we've picked up directly from yesterday's reading because we've continued on without any formal introduction to this young man, Johannes Kalsgarow. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but, this isn't an English name, and so we're just doing our best. Apologies to Johannes if we've pronounced his name incorrectly. It tells us, though, that this young fellow is now not only a farmer, he's also doing another part-time job, right, Josh?
Yeah, so he was also a part-time tourist guide.
Okay, and it tells us, though, that it hasn't, and when we say it here, we mean the surge in tourists, right? The growing number of visitors hasn't all been a boon for him. Rebecca, what is a boon?
Well, boon is one of our key words here, and the idea here is it just means that to produce something, especially something that improves the quality of life. And so if our lesson says it hasn't all been a boon, it really means that it really hasn't necessarily been helped or produced something that improves the quality of life.
So when I hear this word boon, I always think of the word benefit, but you can't replace the word boon with benefit. So you couldn't say, for example, it hasn't all been a benefit for him. That wouldn't be right. But the idea is maybe you'd want to say a boon is like a time of great benefit or very positive things happening. So you could maybe say that. It hasn't all been positive for him. Why not, Josh?
Well, we did learn yesterday that he was from a very small village, and then all of a sudden it's gone from just him to having about 20,000 visitors to his area a year. And here it talks about overflow crowds parking cars on his fields, and then, of course, the other things you get with hikers leaving litter and not maybe respecting his gate to be enclosed. But here when it talks about overflow crowds, that means anytime you have a certain area that's set up well for a certain number of people, but then too many people come, then you have an overflow of people, and not everybody has maybe enough parking spaces, enough bathrooms, enough places to go. So you have too many people.
Yeah, this use of the word overflow is kind of interesting because often we use the word overflowing, which is basically the same word, but when you add the ing to it, you're describing what is happening. So you might say like, this place, this small village is overflowing with crowds, which means there's so many people that they're spilling out of the place. But when we say overflow crowd, like you said here, Josh, the idea is that the village has enough space for, say, 100 visitors a day, but 110 come. So the 10 extra people are an overflow crowd. And we often see this like in descriptions of maybe arenas or places where you sit, like theaters. We'll say overflow seating, meaning too many people come, you still get a seat, but it's maybe not in the main room. Maybe you're watching what's happening on a video monitor or something like that. And so these crowds, when too many people come, when there's more people than parking spots, they just park their cars on his fields. And, you know, he is a farmer. And if any of you have farm experience, you're maybe a farmer yourself or you grew up on a farm, you know farmers don't like when people mess with their fields, right?
At all. And especially it could be very damaging when somebody parks on your field and there's a lot of rain or a lot of moisture, because then the car ends up damaging the field for a long time.
Yeah, so farmers don't like it when people are parking on their fields or walking through their fields, even at the best of times. But here it gets even worse because some hikers are littering and others have left his red gate open. That's, you know, the most important rule of rural life. Always close a gate behind you, right? And these foolish city people have left his gate open, and what has been the result?
The sheep escape. Now, if I were him, I would actually be really frustrated because it seems like my livelihood, or his livelihood, of course, is being hurt by these tourists. And of course, people, who live in the city folks, they don't always realize, or they're not always sensitive to what they should or should not do when they go out to these remote areas.
Okay, now we've mentioned that this village is now accessible by car, but we've also mentioned that it's pretty isolated. And so he says something that might seem strange, but really isn't if you can sort of picture the environment. If a hiker is injured, it says, Colsgaro calls a helicopter rescue. So a helicopter comes to get them. Now, you might think, why not just dial 119 or 911 or 999, depending on where you live, and get an ambulance to come. But I think the idea here is that they're so remote, it would take a really long time for an ambulance to arrive. And so instead, they use a helicopter.
And it's very possible that there are some areas that you might not actually be able to access with an ambulance. Like even though this particular village you might be able to access, but maybe these people are out hiking, and those areas are so remote that they do need a helicopter.
Meaning that Josh was right yesterday when he described the footpath in yesterday's story as being like a dirt trail.
Right.
Not something you can get your ambulance stretcher down the little bed. Okay, so nonetheless, they have these helicopters, but they're mentioning this helicopter in a paragraph where they're talking about kind of the negative things of tourists. So why is this free helicopter rescue service a negative of the tourist boom?
Well, most people don't realize exactly how expensive it is to run a helicopter, just to have it fly around. But then to also have it go out and have medical staff go out, pick somebody up, take them to a clinic or a hospital is very, very expensive. But the hiker doesn't pay for any of it.
So it's a big cost for the 50,000 local residents who are paying taxes to pay for these services.
Exactly.
I guess that's the idea. So maybe an increase in cost for people living there just to be good hosts for the tourists. Okay, nonetheless, the Faroe Islands are becoming more popular. And so in the next section, we see that there's sort of a struggle to keep up. And that's what they say in the section called growing popularity. It says the small Faroe Islands are trying to keep up with their growing popularity. Now, their popularity has really been pushed by something that happened in 2015. What was that, Rebecca?
Well, we read, the islands were voted the top destination by National Geographic travelers' readers in 2015. And so they got a lot of popularity. They became more popular after they were voted as a top destination in 2015.
That's right. National Geographic, of course, it's a famous organization that produces the National Geographic magazine. This isn't that magazine. This is National Geographic Travelers. So it's a related product that is geared towards people who like travel, but people who like National Geographic stuff. They aren't just ordinary backpackers. They're people who like more exotic experiences, right? National Geographic magazine tells you about the wild and wonderful and interesting cultures and things that are going on in the world around you, as well as things like recent developments in science. And so I suppose the idea is that these travelers are also people who are interested in unique and exotic experiences. And so when it was recommended by the magazine, it became a place to go. And so to try to accommodate those people, they haven't built a whole bunch of huge hotels.
Instead, there have been a number of Airbnbs that have popped up. So just sort of appeared all of a sudden in order to accommodate people who want to stay on the island.
And the idea is that's basically a smaller place, like an apartment or a room that's being rented out for people who are traveling through. Right?
Exactly.
But I guess as the numbers have grown, they've been pushed more and more towards the hotels, because it tells us 2 hotels were being built in the capital last year during the writer's visit. So they've now come to the point where Airbnb can't accommodate all the people. And the hotels they're building aren't just sort of locally owned hotels. They use this term, the chain hotel. What exactly is that?
A chain hotel, we have Hilton and Garden Inn. This just refers to a group of hotels that usually pop up all over the place.
Okay, so Hilton is a famous hotel chain, right? When we say chain hotel, we mean hotels that are located in different places, but are basically the same hotel, or at least the same company. So they offer the same services and things like that. That brings us to our second reading, which is actually a continuation of this reading. But listeners, you'll find that on page 14. Let's have a look at that now.
It's a little dot on the map, but there's a lot going on here, said David Whale, a British transplant who co-owns Heimdall Tours. Visitors are drawn to the fresh air and dramatic mountain and North Atlantic vistas as an antidote to their fast-paced life, he said. You come here and literally take that deep breath. In fact, there are only 5 traffic lights and more sheep than residents across the 18 main islands, known for windy and wet weather. It becomes the land of 10,000 waterfalls, Whale said. Finding the right balance. According to Visit Faroe Islands, 2/3 of residents viewed tourism as a net positive in 2018. But a majority want legislation related to access to nature. The Tourist Board has a new plan to preserve its land and said it will advocate for a nature preservation fee for visitors. As we returned to Tórshavn, I marveled at waterfalls cascading down hillsides around every bend and hoped that the Faroes would find the right balance between protecting its raw landscape and welcoming visitors who come to see that very thing.
Okay, and so this reading begins with a quote from someone who's not actually Faroese. Instead, this is a British person who has been transplanted. They are a transplant to the islands. Essentially, that means it's a person who has moved there to live there because he's working for and owning a tour company. And this person describes the Faroe Islands as a little dot on the map, but then goes on to say there's a lot going on there. Now, so far we've mentioned mostly kind of nature, things like that. But if you have your magazine with you, you'll notice that down the right-hand side of this page, there are a few other interesting sorts of things that are more human-built, right? Josh, you want to tell us about the village that is mentioned at the top? I will try to say it incorrectly. Not intentionally, but it probably will be incorrect. Kirkjubor, the village. Tell us what's going on there.
So Kirkjubor is known as a historic village with a medieval cathedral, which is really interesting because I wouldn't normally associate something so remote with a medieval cathedral, which was usually a large church built out of stone or some other material like that.
Yeah, we think of famous cathedrals, medieval cathedrals, as being in places like Paris or Rome, Western European places. We don't so much think of them as being in places like tiny little islands way in the north, right? And so tourist sites there. There's also a picture of some government buildings under a little label, Viking territory, Rebecca.
Right. We read in Tinganes, a historic area of Tórshavn, Red. Hey, you know.
Hey, we're all doing our best.
Of the
names,
capital
right?
of the Faroe Islands.
You go. I'm doing my best too. Yes,
Good
the
for
capital
you.
of the Faroe Islands. Red government buildings with grass roofs stand in an area that was once the Vikings' General Assembly. Evidence of Irish and Viking roots are scattered across the islands, from Viking burial grounds to Kirkjubor, a settlement from the Middle Ages.
And that's actually the village that Josh just talked about, having the cathedral. So I don't know if you know very much about Viking culture, but they frequently lived in these long houses that actually had grass growing on the roof. It provided insulation in the cold climate, I suppose, things like that. And so it's basically, we're talking about kind of northern Viking-style government buildings here in this place. The idea being that these islands have a really long history of human occupation, and there, as a result, are lots of interesting things to see and do in those places. But in addition to these kinds of cultural sites, if we get back to our reading, we see that we learn visitors are drawn to the fresh air and dramatic mountain and North Atlantic vistas. There's that word vistas again, meaning views of scenery. And the reason they're drawn there is because it helps them with a problem. We see this word antidote. Josh, what's going on here?
Well, people are looking for an antidote to their fast-paced life. So an antidote normally is a way to prevent something bad from happening. Or like say, for example, if you get poisoned, if you might get very sick unless you're able to take the antidote, which will stop you getting sick from the poison. And here, the sort of drawing a connection to a fast-paced life and the stress that comes from it being very bad for you. So being able to go to a North Atlantic vista with the dramatic mountains and the fresh air is going to help you sort of escape the bad effects of a fast-paced life.
So little kids, when they're born, they're given a bunch of needles that protect them from sicknesses. Are those antidotes?
No, not exactly. So those would actually be vaccines, right? So those are something you take in order to stop something bad from happening altogether.
So if you take those, you don't get sick.
Exactly.
But when you've already become sick, you take an antidote. And it cures you of the sickness. So the idea here is that people who are living in cities and living fast-paced lives come to this place to be cured of their stress. I guess that's the idea, right? You come here and literally take that deep breath. Oh, you're
That's
breathing,
right.
Rebecca.
I just took a nice deep breath. I was imagining that I was there.
I thought you were preparing to say something.
Well, I do have something to say. I think it's really cool because in our next section it says there are only 5 traffic lights and more sheep than residents across the 18 main islands, known for windy and wet weather. Now, I know that in a city, traffic lights are very important, but there definitely is something really cool and refreshing about visiting a place, at least in my mind, it seems like this, visiting a place that only has 5 traffic lights. Wow, that's actually pretty cool. You don't have to sit at the traffic lights for 2 minutes waiting for it to turn green.
Yeah. It also tells us that this is still pretty isolated and rural, right?
Not a lot of
Exactly.
cars.
So even though there are more tourists, that, like the weather, is relative. Right? It's not like it's Disneyland where there's crowds and crowds of people walking down each street.
Right. There's a lot of tourists compared to the number of residents or compared to the number of tourists that used to visit.
But still not packed with crowds of people like you might find in a shopping mall the day before Christmas.
Exactly.
And they're trying to sort of keep it that way. We find in the last section that they're trying to find the right balance. The idea of the right balance being, in this sense, the right number of tourists so that the islands can benefit, but not so many tourists that, you know, sort of the environment and the experience is destroyed and changes too much. This, according to Visit Faroe Islands, which is an organization that is promoting tourism on the islands, they've done a survey and they found that most people like tourism. Right, Josh?
Yeah, here they say that 2/3 of residents viewed tourism as a net positive in 2018.
Okay, so when we say net positive, we mean they know there are some problems, but overall they think it's a good thing.
Exactly.
Right? Okay. And so, despite that, the majority of people who are residents want some new laws. They say here legislation. So what do they want these laws for, Rebecca?
Well, they want laws relating to access to nature. And they want to make some laws that will help preserve the land and preserve some of their parks and areas. Now, and I can understand that because if you have this remote area and then all of a sudden you have all these tourists coming and the tourists aren't really being careful, they're just walking, going wherever they want to go, eventually it could destroy that area.
Well, if you live in that village we were talking about earlier that only has 3 families in it, you know, you don't need a national park to protect the environment because everybody's living there, and there aren't really very many people, and there's a whole lot of nature. But as the number of people increase, maybe you want to think about setting aside some of the natural areas to make sure that people aren't, littering and doing things like that.
One of the things we learned from the first day of the article is that so many people are walking around in the area that now they're creating trails and footpaths just by walking along the ground that had never been there before. And one of the things that is really terrible for a natural area is when you have a lot of foot traffic or footpaths that turn into bare dirt from people walking on them, and then you have a lot of wind and you have a lot of rain, and you get a lot of erosion, which means that a lot of the land can just sort of wash away, and then all of a sudden you've really changed the landscape around you.
Okay, and so the tourist board is hoping to preserve things, but they're also planning to charge a fee that will be used to help preserve the environment and things like that. Then we return to, and this is the capital again. I can't remember how Manya said it in the reading. I'm going to try Torshaven and acknowledge that might be wrong. Don't write in about that, listeners. If I've pronounced it the wrong way, I won't understand your email either. There, the writer marveled at waterfalls cascading down hillsides. When something cascades, it means it flows very quickly down the hillsides around every bend, and hoped that the Faroes would find the right balance between protecting its landscape and welcoming visitors. And so that's it. The writer who has visited enjoyed the experience and hopes that the experience isn't ruined by huge crowds of tourists. I hope that too, because I'd like to visit someday, and I would like to see it in all its natural wonder. What about you two?
I would love to see it too. Sometimes I get worried about discovering places like this after they become very popular, but hopefully they will be able to find a good balance.
And I agree. I do hope one day I'll have an opportunity to take a trip to the Faroe Islands.
Thank you so much for joining us, listeners, as we've gone through our May Travel article. We hope you'll join us for another advanced studio classroom in the days to come. Until then, I'm Simon.
I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Josh.
Saying bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.